an election year in Colorado. We have with us one of the candidates for governor. This is Scott Gessler, who is the current Secretary of State for Colorado, and who's had a long and interesting career in law and politics, and we're going to have a chance to hear from him a little bit. Toward the end of the year, we'll do a long unit on civics and the way the government works and functions and the different jobs in government and the different roles. And so we have the chance, before we do that, to hear from one of the current high leaders of our state, who will talk to us a little bit about what he does, what his job entails, let you ask him some questions about what it's like to run for governor, what it's like to run the office of the Secretary of State for the state of Colorado, and any other questions you might have. It's a really interesting and good opportunity, and so we're going to let Mr. Gessler speak to us for a few minutes. And while he speaks, please be thinking and jotting down some questions that you'd like to ask him, and we can take this conversation further. Thank you so much for being here.
Am I able to actually write on this thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's markers there in the tray.
Okay. So, how many of you all know what the Secretary of State does? I'll be amazed if a single person raises their hand. All right. Have you dealt with the issues of federalism and separation of powers at all, things like that? Is that a nod? Yes? Okay. So let me tell you, I'm going to tell you what the Secretary of State does, and I'm sort of going to fit it into this. So we've got, we spend a lot of time looking at the federal government, and there's three branches, right? You've got the, what are they? Executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch, okay? And so federalism, when we talk about federalism, it's sort of a separation of powers, splitting up the government, right? And so you've got these three branches that people talk about. Well, there's another concept of federalism too, and that's splitting powers up between the federal government and state governments. All right, so our federal Constitution has what are called enumerated powers, in other words, stuff that the federal government is supposed to do. And then there's another one that says everything else should be left to the states. And there's some controversy about what everything else really is. But everything else should be left to the states. So Colorado is one of the 50 states. So all that other stuff is left to us. Now, Colorado, we also have our three branches of government. And what are they again? We got legislative, judicial, and executive. So, each state does it a little bit differently. So the federal government, well, let's look at legislature. So our legislature is modeled after Congress. We have two houses, a Senate and a House, okay, or two chambers, I should say, Senate and a House. So just like the federal government's the same way. Judiciary, oh, thank you very much. So judiciary, we're a little bit different than the federal government. In the judiciary, the president appoints our judges, right? And it's confirmed by the Senate. Colorado, we do it differently. We have a group of people, they're called nominating commissions. They choose 3 people. And then our governor chooses from one of those 3 people. So it's a little bit different. And then the executive branch. So in the federal government, we've got a president, right? He runs everything in the executive branch. In the state, what we've done in Colorado is we've split the executive branch into 4 pieces. 4 elected officials. So you've got the governor, who does most of the stuff with the executive branch. So Department of Transportation and Department of Health and all those people are underneath him. Then we've got the Attorney General. So we have an Attorney General in the federal government. He's basically the lawyer, or she sometimes, now it's a he, is the lawyer for the federal government. We independently elect our Attorney General. So the governor doesn't appoint our Attorney General. Currently a he is independently elected. So he runs all the lawyers in the state of Colorado. So everyone who gets represented in court, he's the guy who does it. He does legal policy as well for the state. Then we have the treasurer. He's independently elected in Colorado as well. He's the guy who holds all the money. So all the taxes come in, fees, he invests them, makes sure they're held properly, and then disperses them. He doesn't decide who gets money and who gives money, but he holds the money. Then we have what's called the Secretary of State. Now, governor, that sort of makes sense. Attorney General, okay, an attorney. Treasurer, money. Secretary of State. What the heck does a Secretary of State do? So I would go around and I would, first of all, I would tell people that no, the Secretary of State does not take notes for the legislature, okay, or make travel arrangements. Secretary of State in every state is a little bit different. Every state's a little bit different, and not every state has a Secretary of State. In Colorado, we do. So my job is, well, let me get to my job in a sec. Then we have a couple other things with our executive branch authority. So we have what's called a Board of Education, okay? This is a board, and they've got 9 members on it, elected from each one of the congressional districts, plus a couple at large. They sort of administer the schools, K through 12 schools. So this is a charter school. Mr. Schaefer used to serve on the Board of Education, used to be president of it. President? Chairman? Chairman of the Board of Education. So they do K through 12 stuff. So the governor doesn't directly control the budget and the bureaucracy. The Board of Education does, and they hire someone who's the head of the Department of Education. And then we have a couple other things. We've got like the CU Regents, University of Colorado Regents. So that's technically part, well not technically, that's part of state government, but they have an independently elected board as well. Now all of these parts of this executive branch, they all have to follow the laws as set by the legislature. And they all have to, and as interpreted by the judiciary. But you can see that in the state of Colorado, what we've done is we've split up our executive branch power. Now, some states split it up even more. Like some states, they'll have a department, a commissioner, you know, an insurance commissioner. He'll be directly elected. Or they'll have a railroad commissioner or board, or an agricultural commissioner. I think Georgia has something like 14 independent elected state offices. So they split it up in a lot of ways. Other states are fewer. So what does the Secretary of State do? The thing that most Secretaries of State do, and that I do, 2 main jobs. I'm the Chief Election Officer for the state of Colorado. So I run the elections, basically. And then I do business registrations. So if you start a new business or you do certain filings, documents that you have to file with the state, you file them with my office. Now beyond that, Secretaries of State do all kinds of different things. For example, in our Colorado Constitution, I am the guy who regulates bingo and raffles. Bingo games and raffles. That's me. So if you want to do bingo or raffle for money, I'm the guy. Notaries public. So if you've ever signed where you have to sign a document in front of someone and they put a stamp on it, I'm the one who licenses that. Other Secretaries of State, I think the one in Wyoming, he regulates mixed martial arts fighting. We've got one who handles the Capitol Police. He runs the Capitol grounds out of Arkansas. That works out pretty well for him because he has the best office in the entire state capitol. So he gets to run the Capitol Police. So there's all kinds of variations. When you look at my duties total, elections, business registrations are the big deal. I do bingo raffle, notaries public, people who lobby the state government, they have to register with me. Nonprofits who collect money, hire someone to collect money, they have to register with my office. I'm also in charge of the state seal. No one in the state of Colorado is allowed to use the state seal without me approving it. So it has to be done for official business. We actually had, this was before I took office. Have you heard of Dog the Bounty Hunter? You guys ever heard of him? So he's got, or he used to have, a medallion. He's from Colorado. And he used to have this big medallion he'd wear around his neck with a state seal on it. And that's illegal. He wasn't supposed to do that. So someone from our office called him up and said, you're supposed to take that down. He wasn't very receptive to that. But I guess ultimately he removed it. I was over at the state capitol 2 years ago and he was there. And there's like all the media, and I was sort of looking around the corner to see if he still had that around his neck. Thankfully he didn't, so he didn't have to take action. So this is what Secretary of State does. Primarily elections, and primarily business registrations. So the business registration side is really sort of the boring part. If you go on the website, so I've got a website, and you can register online, which that's about it. It's pretty easy. Colorado, we have pretty low fees. You have to pay money to start a business. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes. What we try to do is make everything online, everything that we can, which sounds pretty straightforward, but a lot of states don't have that yet. A lot lot of states don't have it. They still have paper. You have to send your check in, a piece of paper, fill it out in duplicate, and only use black ink. That's actually the rules for the state of Illinois. So it varies there. The elections is the one that gets a lot of the attention. So I had my 15 minutes of fame back in 2012 because we had a presidential election, and Colorado is a battleground swing state. So everyone gets really uptight, and they're very uptight's one way of saying it. Everyone's very focused on the election, let's say. And they're very, very focused on what the rules are for how the election works. So who gets ballots in the mail versus not in the mail, what type of identification you may have to show at the polls, what people are allowed to do as a poll worker and what they can't do. We have watchers who come in to be able to watch things, and what rights do they have as watchers. I actually had someone here, 2 people from the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So they showed up and they were going to monitor our elections. And so there were a lot of people in the state who were very upset that someone from another country would be coming to monitor our elections. So I met with them, I actually felt sorry. They didn't have a car. So they were going to monitor our elections and they didn't have a car. And I suggested that maybe they get a rental so that they could drive out to go monitor. They didn't have the budget for that, so I think they walked across the street to watch Denver, and then someone took pity on them and gave them a ride down to Colorado Springs. So they were sort of harmless. But lots of attention focused on the Secretary of State's office. So I got, it was sort of neat, but I got interviewed by all kinds of different newspapers, one from Mexico City, one from England, because they all wanted to know what's going on in Colorado, the swing state. When you look at elections, Colorado does some interesting things. There's a couple types of democracy. So we learn about representative democracy, right? And representative democracy, a republic, is where we elect our officials, and then our officials go off and make the laws. So we don't make the laws directly. Now, but we also have in Colorado what's called direct democracy. Are you guys familiar with that term at all? Probably not. So direct democracy has 3 forms. It's called a recall, the referendum, and the initiative. And basically that's a way of saying people in Colorado can directly make the laws ourselves. We don't have to go through the legislature. So have you ever heard of an initiative on the ballot? So we have in Colorado initiatives. So last election cycle, there were some initiatives. For example, there was a request to increase taxes. That was an initiative. So someone just, I shouldn't say off the street, but anyone, 2 people together, can come up with an idea for a law. And then they go out and collect signatures from a lot of other people who say, yeah, we want that to be on the ballot. And then if people in Colorado vote on that, that becomes the law. So that is a form of the legislative power. So we have representative democracy and direct democracy. Now, the reason I talk about that is when it comes to the initiative process, my office is in charge of regulating the statewide direct democracy process as well. So, if you, let's say you 2 come up and you've got a law. Any law you want to pass? If you were king, what's a law that someone would want to pass? You guys ever thought there should be a law for that? Have you ever thought that? All right, someone come up with a law. Throw me a bone here.
Free pizza.
Free pizza. All right. So every pizzeria, 1 out of every 5 pizzas they make has to be free for someone. All right? And you want that to be a law. I tell you, we've had stranger laws in Colorado. So you get together with a friend and you write out your law. And then what happens is you sort of, it gets reviewed by people so that you can make changes to it if you want, but you don't have to. And then what you do is you go through what's called a title board. That means to figure out what the words are going to be that show up on the ballot. And then you go out and collect a whole bunch of signatures. You have to collect about 90,000 ballot signatures. And you got about 6 months to do it. So everyone in the class, you guys get a little clipboard here, and you go out and start asking people who can vote to sign your petition. Have you ever seen people doing that? All right, so that's what they're doing. And so you get people to sign, and you turn in your petitions. My office reviews all those signatures to make sure that they're okay. So we review the signatures, and if you have enough signatures, guess what? It goes on the ballot. So now your free pizza, 1 out of every 5 pizzas. We don't want to say every pizza, because then no one would ever make pizzas again. But 1 out of every 5 pizzas has to be free. So that goes on the ballot. And if it gets passed, if the people in the state of Colorado want free pizza, that's what they do. That becomes a law through the legislature. The judiciary enforces it, and the executive branch executes it as they're required to do. So, when you look at sort of separation of powers, it gets a lot more complex, doesn't it? All right, now we've got the federal government up here. They've got their 3 branches. Then we've got everything that's not there reserved to the states. Here's the state of Colorado. We've got legislative, judicial, executive. In the legislative, we have 2 ways of exercising legislative power. We have the legislature, has to go through the House, has to go through the Senate, has to be signed by the governor. That's a legislative power there. Or we have direct democracy, where it just goes straight to the people and they vote on something. We've got a judiciary with the appointment process is a little bit different. And then we have our executive branch that's split up a whole bunch of different ways. Now, for me, it's split up even another way. So I've got the Secretary of State here, and I say I run elections. And that's not quite accurate. It's close, but not exactly true. I set the policies. The people who actually run the elections are what are called clerks and recorders in each one of our 64 counties. So we have 64 counties. What county do you all live in here? Larimer. So you've got a Larimer clerk and recorder. They're the ones who buy the equipment. They're the ones, their staffs are the ones who actually count the votes. So I don't count any votes. They're the ones who do it. But I establish the policies and the certifications and things and the training by which they do all that work. And as you can guess, in every single difference between one of these boxes, there is tension. So I am dealing with the clerks and recorders all the time. Sometimes we cooperate, sometimes we have disagreements, just as sometimes there's cooperation and disagreement between there. So this is how it's all broken apart. For those of you who are constitutional scholars in here, remember I told you that all the powers are reserved, these other powers are supposed to be reserved to the states that are part of the federal Constitution? Remember I told you that? There's a couple exceptions. One of the things that is specifically allowed here is Article 1, Section 4, okay, which says the time, manner, and places of elections shall be set in each state by the legislature thereof. It says the legislature thereof, except that from time to time Congress may make such laws as it deems fit. So Congress actually has power to tell us exactly how to run elections for federal elections. Not necessarily for our own state elections, but for federal elections. Congress has the authority to directly get involved. Now, Secretary of State is elected. So what we have in Colorado is Republicans and Democrats, just like other states. I'm a Republican, and so I got elected to run for office. So the way you get elected, Mr. Schaefer can of course talk a lot about getting elected, is frankly you just sort of step up and say, I want to get elected. That's a lot. Over half of it is just having the desire and the fortitude to go ahead and do it. Having a free pizza platform over there, something that you want to run on, some change you want to make, something that you want to do, and just going out and doing it. The nomination process in Colorado, we have a 2-way nomination process. One, you say, I just want to do it, and you go out and collect signatures again. All right, just like you did with your direct democracy initiative. Or what you do is you go through what's called the caucus process. We have caucuses in Colorado. That means any Republican or any Democrat can show up one night, once every 2 years, at a caucus. They elect delegates to a county and a state party. They elect nominees to our ballot. We have a primary ballot and then a general election ballot. So that's how it works. We also have a lot of regulation on how you can raise money here in the state of Colorado. Who you can raise it from, how much you can get at any one time, and that creates a lot of controversy. I, for one, think that a lot of this stuff violates the First Amendment, because telling people how they can raise money and how they can spend money in elections really implicates their speech, their freedom of speech. So that's my view, but there's a lot of controversy on it. This process here is very freewheeling, let me put it that way. Not a lot of regulations except for the campaign finance and your ballot access rules. The things you can say just about anything you want of other people. Sometimes good, sometimes somewhat slanderous. Every election someone will say something nasty about someone else, and that person will threaten to sue. That just sort of never seems to happen because it doesn't make sense to have big fights like that in public. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense if someone wants to get elected. Before I became Secretary of State, I was an attorney. So I was an attorney for about 10 years, and I practiced election law. So that was my specialty, was elections. The direct democracy initiatives and the campaign finance and how you get on the ballots and how people count votes, all that stuff. I was a lawyer, and so I did all of that stuff. So when I ran for Secretary of State, I was able to tell people that I myself was a subject matter expert in elections, that I knew about elections, and that's why they should elect me. And the people of Colorado ultimately decided to do that. So, a little bit about how Secretary of State fits into the overall government structure, and a little bit about politics, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. Dr. Robinson or anyone else?
Well, thank you. First, let's thank him for his remarks. And I've got a whole list of questions, but I'd rather you all ask questions, so let's...
What if there's like a law that people want, that they get enough signatures but isn't good for it isn't good for them, like if they want to, it to be legal to have drugs whenever they want or whatever, what if, would it get passed if they get enough signatures?
Okay, so that's a good question. And the question is, okay, let's say there's a law that would be illegal. Would it get passed even if there's enough signatures? So the question is, what does or doesn't make it legal? First question. And there's two ways a law can be illegal. One is it violates the federal Constitution, right? Violates the federal Constitution. Or we have a state constitution that governs us, and then we have laws under that. So let's say they're trying to get a law passed. What the courts have said, what the judiciary says is, we're not going to touch that until it actually passes. Because we don't know if it's really going to pass or not. So we'll let people vote on it, and then if it passes, and then if someone says it's unconstitutional or it violates a law, then we'll hear it in the judiciary. And then the initiative, remember, it's the exercise of legislative power, it's treated just like any other law. Just like any other law. So it has to comport, has to follow our state constitution, which sets up this whole structure. And of course it has to follow the federal constitution. So it's treated just like any law that the legislature would make. But a court won't look at it until after it gets passed by the people. Just like a court won't look at anything going through the legislature. They won't say, hey, that bill will violate the law. They'll wait until the bill becomes a law, and then the courts will look at it. So it's treated the exact same way. So think of it as just another exercise of the legislative power. Any other questions? Yeah?
What did the OSCE stand for again?
OSCE, I'm sorry. Sorry for throwing out FLAs. That's a 4-letter acronym. Or TLA, 3-letter acronym. OSCE stands for Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So a bunch of Europeans who come out here meddling in our elections. At least that's what some people thought. I sort of joked about it because one of the OSCE people was from Bosnia. I actually served in the army in Bosnia too long ago. 18 years ago, 17 years ago. And one of the things I did was watch how their elections were being set up when they first made the transition over to democracy. So for someone to come over here and say they were going to watch my elections, I felt, what do you mean? I watch your elections, you don't watch my elections. But it was all fine. So that's Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a multinational organization that goes around sometimes monitoring U.S. elections. You have a question?
So, you said there were a bunch of really strange laws that attempted to get passed. What were some of those?
Well, for example, a lot of people make fun of our Constitution because we have a lot of stuff in our Constitution. So one of the strange laws that you probably wouldn't expect is it is illegal to hunt female bears during mating season in Colorado. And that's not just a law, that's part of our Constitution. Okay? For example, bingo raffle is specifically assigned to the Secretary of State in our Constitution, not in our laws. So I'm not going to ridicule too many laws that I disagree with, but I would say there's some interesting stuff in there.
How do you
Yeah.
feel about the marijuana, like?
How do I feel about the marijuana law? I am frankly not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of it. Look, I mean, my view, have you ever seen any of those old cigarette commercials? You know, 4 out of 5 doctors recommends Lucky Strike cigarettes. Have you ever seen any of those? You know, or Camel cigarettes keeps your throat nice and cool and fresh, right? And we look back on that and we say, what were those people thinking? Because we know cigarettes are pretty darn bad. Now some people still smoke them, I doubt that. I think right now, 50 years from now, people are going to look back at our day and say, what were these people thinking about when they thought marijuana was okay? I think it causes lung cancer. Well, it's not just me. The medical evidence shows it increases your chances for lung cancer. It reduces your intelligence if you use it permanently. And it increases the likelihood of schizophrenia, mental illness. It's not good stuff. And you all, I think, have more challenges growing up than what I had. Because with me it was illegal when I grew up. Now, there were a lot of kids in my school that used it. But I don't think as a society we should be celebrating that. That said, it's part of the law, it's part of our Constitution, so the executive branch has to carry it out, and the judiciary has to enforce the laws. Now the legislature can make laws and regulations to give shape to that or to implement it, but it's still basically the law of the land. So my goal, I think we have to try and find a way to mitigate the harms. I think you had a question?
How long does the secretary, like how long do you get to keep your position before there's another election?
That's actually a good question, one that I didn't address. So, every one of these, 4-year terms. 4-year terms. In the legislature, we have the Senate and the House. 2-year terms for the House, 4-year terms for the Senate. 4-year terms for these are called constitutional officers, these 4, because they're listed in the Constitution. Board of Education, 6-year terms, CU Regents, 6-year terms. That's how it works. Our elections are on the non-presidential year. So 2012 we had a presidential election. I got elected in 2010. I would be up for re-election if I wanted to run again in 2014, but I'm not. We also have in Colorado term limits. The maximum anyone can serve here are 2 terms, 8 years. 2 terms here. 4 terms here for 8 years, and 2 terms here for 8 years as well. And then constitutionally, you're not allowed to serve anymore. Now you can serve a little bit longer if you get appointed in the second half of a term to a half term. It gets rounded, basically. So we have an Attorney General who's going on his 10th year. That's because he was appointed by the governor, served out almost 2 years, then has had 2 8-year terms. So that's how it works in Colorado. You've got a lot of, I'll get you some more. Are there any other questions in here? Yes?
How does your job as Secretary of State like relate to the whole like Secretary of State for the president? Like, do you guys do similar jobs at all?
Well, sort of. So one of the jobs that the Secretary of State does that I didn't talk about is I certify stuff. I do what are called apostilles, which are like international notarization. So if you want to buy something from a foreign country, you have to have that stamped, an apostille, and then a foreign country will recognize that apostille. Our U.S. Secretary of State, we all know her as sort of the chief diplomat, who runs around doing diplomatic stuff. But one of the things the Secretary of State has to do a lot of is certify things, even on the federal level. So there's this whole underlying nuts and bolts of government certification stuff that I do that our federal Secretary of State does too. But no one pays attention to that at all. I heard Condoleezza Rice speak, so she's a former Secretary of State. And she said, when I was Secretary of State, they would bring me all of this stuff to sign. Like, I had to sign all of this stuff, like this certification here and there. I was like, well, why am I doing all of this? Well, that was one of the most important original duties back in the, late 18th century and early 19th century that the federal Secretary of State did, and our state secretaries do that as well. But no one talks about that, because it's really boring. I have an auto pen writer that signs my signature to lots of stuff I don't even know exists. So when someone gets extradited, if there's a criminal here and they get sent to another state or vice versa, I'm the guy who signs the thing saying, here's the criminal, go, take this person. So that's the official document that I sign. Now, I don't really sign it because it gets signed for me essentially. But that's one of the things that the Secretary of State's office does. Lots of certification documents. Yes?
I know one of the things your office does is register businesses, and I know you've also started a business yourself. So I wonder if you could give any advice for any budding entrepreneurs in here, or what they should know about starting a business in Colorado.
So so at the Colorado Secretary of State's office, our sort of mission statement is we serve the American dream. We serve the American dream. Now, what is the American dream? Obviously, it has many components, but two of the components, I think, are political freedom, the ability to vote for people, and the ability to participate in our political system, which is rare on this earth. And the other thing is economic freedom, the ability to build a business, to build your future, to make your way in life as you see fit. And so, Secretary of State is the first stop for that. You can register online with my office if you have a driver's license, and you start a business as well with us. Now, in Colorado, it's really easy to do. You can go online. You have to fill out, your name. You got to pay $50, which is pretty cheap compared to other states. And you have to, say where your business is located and who your registered agent is in case someone wants to sue you or the state has to notify you. You have to have all that. But it takes you 15 minutes and then you're off and running. And you have a legal entity to create a business and to start your own business. Other states, it'll take longer. You have to send in a piece of paper or wait a couple weeks, things like that. Colorado, it's pretty easy. When you have a business, so the reason why having a business is so important, a corporation or a partnership, is so that it gets sued and you don't. It's a thing for liability, contractual liability, or if someone slips and falls, they would sue the business, not you. So your risk is you can lose all the money you put into the business, but not anymore. It gives you some protection. And that's one of the reasons why we're able to do so well, I think, in this country, is we have these liability shields, is what they're called in the legal side. So I don't regulate all the licenses you may have to have. So you build this building, that wall that Mr. Schaefer needs to tear down, or plaster, as it were. There's regulations that say what that wall has to look like and how thick it has to be, and the fire codes and all that stuff. I don't handle that. But businesses, when they build that stuff, they have to follow that, or a business like a school, it has to adhere to that. I don't handle all that. I did start a business here in Colorado. I had a couple, and a partnership. The thing that I did mostly before I became Secretary of State was practice law. So that was a business itself. And you go out and try and give people a service or a product and get money from them and save it up and earn a living. And that's, in large part, what the American dream is about, being able to do that. So if you were to take the state seal off of my office, we'd basically be a high-volume e-commerce business. So we do lots and lots of transactions online. Stuff a little bit more boring than downloading music, but still pretty critical nonetheless. So we do a lot of businesses. I have over 500,000 active registered businesses in the state of Colorado today. So a lot. Any other questions? You had one? You forgot it by now?
Oh, why does the House only have 2 years for a term?
2 years. Okay, so it's modeled after the federal government. So the federal government, I think the best way to look at it is, so if you look at the federal legislature, we have a House of Representatives, and a Senate. And how long does the House serve, members in the House serve in the federal government? Anyone know? 2 years. And in the Senate, anyone know? 6 years. And the goal here was to have the House more responsive to stuff that goes on in society. So if there's a big movement, you know, like you've heard the Tea Party movement, right? So since there's an election every 2 years, the House is going to be very responsive, because every 2 years someone has to stand for election. So they're always going to be paying attention to what happens every 2 years. The goal in the Senate, on the federal side, was to make it every 6 years. So they're a little bit insulated for fads and stuff. It has to be more long-term. So the hope was that they would have a more long-term view, and they would have a, I don't want to say shorter-term view, but they would be more in tune with what's going on in the here and now. And that's sort of what our Senate and House is supposed to be like as well. We have 65 House members, and we have 35 Senate members, which is similar, 100 in the federal side of the Senate, and 435 in the House. Okay, so in most states, you'll see more House members with a shorter term, and fewer Senate members with a long term. And that's a way to balance a desire for people to be in touch with what's going on right away, the urgent stuff, sudden changes, versus having a long-term view and being a little bit insulated from all those sudden changes. So that's why that is split up that way. It doesn't work exactly like the federal government, but it's sort of modeled. A little bit of trivia. This is called a bicameral legislature. Bi means two. I don't know what cameral means. All right, maybe chamber. Chamber. So it's a two-chamber legislature. There's one state that has a unicameral chamber. Anyone know what that is? Nebraska. Nebraska doesn't have a House and a Senate. It just has one chamber. Actually, among our founders, Benjamin Franklin thought that was the best way to go about doing things. And most foreign governments, you've heard of parliaments? You've heard of a parliament? They have a parliamentary system. They have one chamber, and their executive is not elected by the people, it's elected by the legislature instead. That's how they divide it up. So ours is a little bit different. Okay, any other questions?
I've got 2 more. I'll just give them to you both at the same time, and you can respond to them how you'd like. First of all, in your election law practice, I'm wondering what kinds of cases an election law practice sees. And also your bio mentioned that you played tournament chess at some point. And as the leader of the chess club here, I wanted to hear a little more about that.
Okay, so more about me. Gosh, I've talked about myself. So, elections stuff, sort of what my practice was like and the type of stuff I did. So one of my clients actually was, you knew I was going to say that, Mr. Bob Schaefer. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. We had a case where his organization was sued. So we went into court, and the other side didn't have any witnesses, and they were about ready to lose their case. And so they looked around to try and find one witness who they could get to say something to help them out. And Mr. Schaefer was the only one in the room. So they called on him to come testify. And so we had fun. So in my cases, you deal with election law. So some of the things we have are redistricting and reapportionment. That happens once every 10 years. That is how our seats are configured. So in other words, we have state of Colorado here. Okay, here's the state of Colorado. And let's say we have 5 legislative seats. So you'd have 1 here, let's say 1 here, and 1 here, and then 2 more like that. Okay? Well, you could have different types of legislative seats. Instead of having them that way, you know, you could have 5 like that, for example. Okay? So there's big fights, big legal battles over what the map should look like. All right? So that's redistricting. For the federal side, it's called, for Congress, it's called reapportionment. for this. So those were some of my cases. I told you we had campaign finance laws. Who can collect money from whom and how much it can be and all that stuff. People fight about all that all the time. The initiative, the direct democracy process. So you went out and collected signatures for your 1 out of every 5 free pizzas. I say, no, those weren't valid signatures. You say, yes, they were valid signatures. So we have a fight about that. All right, I try and prevent you from getting on the ballot. Or, remember I told you we figure out what those words are that show up on the ballot? That can be really important. So there'll be fights about that as well. What else? Voting Rights Act. That's a federal act, Federal Voting Rights Act. I brought a case on behalf of actually a Hispanic candidate, and I said, look, I mean, he had been treated poorly and unfairly. So that was a case I brought. So that stuff actually kept me pretty busy. Colorado I call the perfect storm when it comes to election law. Not all states have direct democracy. In fact, very few states east of the Mississippi have direct democracy. Direct democracy, if you look at the history, was it came into being like around 1910, 1914. It's about 100 years old, and it was a Western states phenomenon. So a lot of states don't have that. This causes a lot of litigation. A lot of states don't have campaign finance laws. That causes a lot of litigation. Colorado, we've tended to have lots of fights over this stuff as well. And then we have a very complex election system where things can go wrong and we can wind up with litigation there. So I did that a lot. So tournament chess, yeah, I actually won money when I used to play tournament chess. And I was president of our high school chess club. Tournament chess actually I thought was really good because when I took the SAT, I could sit down and stare at that piece of paper for 3 hours without a problem. In fact, the older I've gotten, the shorter my concentration has gotten, I'd say. But you know, the good thing, I always liked it. I don't have time to play it now, but it forces you to concentrate for a long period of time, and that's really important. So my rating, I think I never had my official rating got as high as 1,500. I think I was about a 1,650 player. A lot of times, I usually punched over my weight, which is why I was able to win money. So in tournaments. But we had a pretty good chess team in my high school. So if you like chess, if you like concentrating, I know you all like sitting in one place for a long time, staring at something. That's the game for you. All right, I'll hang around a little bit more. Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed this.
All right, thank you so much. Well, that was great. We really appreciate your time. We've got just a minute or two if you want to go introduce yourself.